Sorry. Okay, hi everyone. All right, so today we are talking about Hegel, Hegel's philosophy of right, or elements of the philosophy of right. Uh, so I want to begin by going over sort of the big picture, which we talked about in class on Monday, but I think could bear repeating. So we're thinking about Hegel in the context of Kant, right, and Kant's universal morality. Now, as we said, the major problem with Kant's morality is that it completely cuts out of the equation the practical realm, right? The ethics, morality for Kant concerns only pure reason, uh, the moral law, and as we recall, uh, the moral law is not um, manifested in the physical world, right? That um, the moral law is completely divorced from the realm of appearances, as Kant says. While Kant has a sort of final theory about what the consequences uh, of the moral law would be, right? The kingdom of ends, the idea that if everyone individually chooses to bind their will to the moral law, we will achieve a global society of uh, right, completely free individuals left to pursue their own ends, who will not exploit others. But we don't see how this moral law or how this kingdom of ends can actually be achieved through practical ends, right? What we can do to work toward it. For Kant, there is no way to work toward it. Uh, Rather, right, the evolution toward that, global society of freedom lies in each one of our individual decisions. Right, every time we choose to follow the moral law, we bring ourselves closer to that sort of utopian goal. And every time we fail to follow the moral law, we uh, fall back away from that. Um, One of the big points of Hegel's philosophy and the philosophy of right is to explain uh, not just what kind of action is required in order to achieve something like Kant's kingdom of ends, right? What would need to happen in the practical world in order to achieve that? And for Hegel, that's going to be uh, largely a process of government, of law, legislation, uh, not, as it is for Kant, merely a question of individual decision, right? It's going to require group organization, group action for Hegel. Um, but more importantly than uh, how practically this can be achieved for Hegel is proving that there can be practical work toward the achievement of what he calls the idea of right, this abstract right, which I think we are correct in connecting to Kant's concept of the moral law. So, how is it that uh, morality as such, something like, as Hegel says, the idea of right, pure abstract idea, analogous to Kant's concept of the moral law, how is it that that idea can, in fact, be made real in the practical realm? Right? This is Hegel's question and project, right? Is the question of how such a high abstract ideal like right or morality can be made real. So, To introduce this possibility, I want to again sort of go over the big idea in Hegel. It bears repeating, and it wasn't laid out really systematically in class. So for Hegel, um, the subject of morality, the subject of philosophy, really, is spirit. He says right in the opening, right, that morality is a question of um, spirit, that spirit is what we need to consider when we're thinking about morality. Sorry, I'm looking for this quote. So, what is spirit for Hegel? Right? Spirit is the realm of right and morality. So, what is spirit? The spirit for Hegel, and this word here is the German word Geist. Spirit, so and Geist can refer not just to sort of spirit in the kind of spiritual sense that we think of it, roughly analogous to soul, although it has that connotation also. But Geist also refers to mind, so kind of spiritual mind um, is this idea of spirit. So spirit is kind of ensouled mind, and spirit exists primarily historically. Now, Hegel is picking up also this idea from Kant to some extent. Um, while Kant's moral law is about the individual, right, and the individual will, uh, we can only make sense of the moral law, and we can only understand the trajectory of the moral law uh, when we consider it historically, when we understand that the utopian ends, the kingdom of ends that are pursued by the moral law won't be accomplished in our lifetime or in a near future, but in some distant point in the future, right? That it develops slowly through history. And this idea Hegel picks up to understand not just the trajectory of morality, as Kant does, but also to understand the meaning of knowledge, right? The meaning of all sort of human development. That ultimately, for Hegel, the human being is properly understood as historical, and the human individual is what it is based on its place in the historical development of humanity. So the subject of philosophy for Hegel is spirit, historical spirit. And historical spirit is what develops knowledge and develops concept of reality. It's also what develops, in some sense, reality itself. So, what does this mean, right? That knowledge develops historically. Well, that sounds pretty obvious in one way, right? Of course, knowledge develops historically, right? We build off of uh, previous knowledge in order to continuously expand our knowledge, obviously. But Hegel has a specific understanding of how this development takes place. And if spirit is the subject, the main sort of object of inquiry for Hegel, his really key idea is about the nature of the development of spirit, the nature of the development of historical spirit. And this idea, which we um, discussed in class, this is the idea of dialectic, right? That historical spirit develops dialectically. And as we're reading the philosophy of right, we see this dialectic uh, at play all the time. And so, again, the dialectic is a movement between two poles, two opposites, two binary opposites. Uh, the most fundamental binary opposite that Hegel's interested in are those of positivity and negativity. Right? That we move between the positive and the negative through history. Uh, so we could also, right, the positive and the negative, we could add to that also the subject and the object, the subject of investigation and the object of investigation. And along the same lines, right, the inner and the outer. These are binary oppositions that Hegel thinks sort of define the framework of dialectical movement. And this dialectical movement is a movement from one pole, one binary term, to the other. So I move from the positive to the negative, and then back again to the positive. I move from the subject to the object, and back again to the subject. So this development occurs through a movement between opposites, but this movement is not, as I said in class, a simple back and forth. That with each moment, right, the moment of positivity, then the moment of negativity, and then the third moment of positivity again, there is a development, not just a back and forth, but a progression upward, uh, an accumulation. And this accumulation occurs through this concept of sublation, right, Aufhebung, which means it's a sort of untranslatable German term that means simultaneously to cancel and preserve. Right? When we move from the positive to the negative and back to the positive, what's happening is when we move from the positive to the negative, we are canceling the positive. We learn what is lacking from the positive by moving to the negative. However, when we move back to the positive, what happens is we incorporate, we preserve that which was canceled in the first moment of positivity. So I explained this in class with the example of, right, learning how to play music. You think you're a very good musician. That's your first moment of positivity. You go out into the world and you discover that you're not as good a musician as you thought you were. You come back into your house to practice more, to reflect on this movement from the inner world of practice to the outer world of performance. You reflect on the moment of negativity, the moment of failure in that externality. And when you return to this positive moment of interiority, you benefit from, you learn from that moment of negativity, the movement from positivity to negativity. And in that next moment of positivity, you've raised your musicianship to a higher level through sublation. Right? You cancel your concept of what a good musician is, um, the concept that you had in the first moment, and right, that cancellation, however, allows you to retain. That cancellation is allows you to develop the next stage of progress, but that progress is predicated on um, that first canceled moment. Right? I can only become better. I can only develop because of that first moment. So even though that first moment is canceled, and I realize that's not sufficient, I can't rely solely on that. I have to nevertheless incorporate it and use it as part of the next moment of positivity and development. So this basic dialectical movement uh, is the movement of education, development, uh, and progression, and we can see sort of all these terms at play. Right, in my first moment of positivity, is internal and subjective. Right, I am relating to myself. I'm right only trying to satisfy myself. Am I a good musician? Well, let me play the song. How does it sound to me? Sounds fine to me. So it's interior. It's a relation of self to self, a self relation, uh, and it's subjective. Right? It's based in my subjectivity. It's positive. Right? It's a moment of development um, of binding myself to some concept. Right? I am a musician. The next moment is external, right? An externalization. I am no longer acting and thinking for myself. I'm now acting and thinking for someone else. My playing is for the other, uh, something outside of me. Uh, so it's a movement toward exteriority, and it's a movement away from subjectivity. Uh, right? Not only is it for others, but it also makes this inner um, subjective development objective, right? And this is, I think, a really key thing here, that right, by moving from the inner to the outer, the subject becomes objectified. The subject becomes an object. I'm no longer relating to myself, developing myself, figuring out how to bind myself to some concept, but now I am presenting myself as an object for evaluation. Right? I objectify myself by bringing myself to the external world, presenting myself to others. And in this moment now of objectification, which has, um, not the negative moral connotation that we might think of it as having, right? That I'm objectified, right? I'm an object. No. I mean, yes, we can certainly ascribe moral meaning to the idea of being objectified, but for Hegel, this objectification is a necessary moment in development, right? That whenever I, as subject, present myself to another person for external consumption, as it were, I've objectified myself. Right? I have presented myself as a thing, as being a representation of a concept. Here I am. I'm a musician. And I'm presenting myself for evaluation as a musician, right? Objective evaluation. Is this person a good musician? So that objectification is an inevitable part of development. Objectification is nothing more than presenting yourself as being a certain kind of way, right? As being this thing. And when I present myself as this thing to someone else, to the external world, I am, right, asking to be considered as an object, right? Something that can be evaluated objectively. Uh, I present myself as an object for an other subject, right? And in this moment, the other is is privileged over the subject, right? I'm asking that some other subject relate to me as an object. I'm a musician. What do you think of me? Um, so objectification is not anything necessarily bad for Hegel. Uh, it's necessary. And then finally, right, by presenting myself as this external thing, uh, I encounter a moment also of negativity, right, where by presenting myself as uh, this particular thing, I open myself to criticism. I have objectified myself. I've asked to be evaluated not as an indeterminate I, right, a pure subject, but as a particular I, an I that has been bound to some concept, uh, musician. And as such, I invite kind of objective evaluation. And I will get this moment of negativity where I learn what is lacking in my self objectification. When I discover that moment of negativity, then I go back and I return to my subjectivity and I develop myself again. I return to this moment of being for myself, uh, where I can again uh, re-bind myself, renegotiate the manner in which I represent myself as this thing. Right? In this return to subjectivity, I uh, I fill out the part of my self objectification, self representation that was lacking in that moment of negativity. And by filling out this moment, in this moment of being for myself, being a subject, uh, I I fill out the concept of myself as musician even more. I become more real as a musician. Right? So uh, through this dialectical movement, I achieve uh, higher and higher degrees of reality in my self-representation. Right? Uh, what it means to be a musician becomes richer and richer for me. Right? The concept of being a musician becomes richer and richer. And as this dialectical movement progresses, I'm able more and more to present my subjectivity as truly being uh, one with the objective content of being a musician, right? Um, so we can see the way as we develop, as this dialectic progresses, that subject and object in this sense become more and more unified. Um, and so the ultimate goal then will be to achieve this quote that we mentioned in class, will be to achieve complete interpenetration of subject and object. Now, complete interpenetration of subject and object. What this will mean is not simply that at the end of the dialectic, I achieve complete unity of subject and object in the sense, using our example, that I am now fully a musician. And there's no distinction between my subjectivity and the objective meaning of being a musician. Instead, it means interpenetration. If we were to say the end goal of this is merely the objectification of the subject as concept, right, as the object musician, right, that the subject would be sort of erased, and all would be that would be left would be the objective idea of a musician. No, right? It would be that at this pinnacle where there's complete interpenetration between subject and object, that my subjectivity is identical to the meaning of being a musician. So that it's not that as subject, I now only do that which the concept of a musician dictates I should do, but instead that the concept of being a musician is now also determined through my subjectivity. So my subjectivity has been uh, bound to this concept of being a musician, and I've achieved uh, a real manifestation of musicianship. Right? I am now really a musician. And what that means is not just that I do everything that the concept of a musician dictates, but that my subjectivity is now uh, right, able to direct what it means to be a musician. That the concept of a musician and my subjective being are completely unified. All right. So as we said in class, this applies not just to the individual, but also to all of history. Right? That history is the realization of the concept of humanity, concept of being, and that as history progresses, we continuously fill that concept of being human, of being real, true, and the pinnacle will be a complete self-understanding. All right, so let's look at this in terms of the idea of right and the philosophy of right.